Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Piccini.
All right. Hello, I'm Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist. This is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, and relationships. And I'm super excited to have a colleague and friend, Jacqueline Mendez, here to talk to us today about a really interesting topic in my point of view in regards to archetypes, in regards to Latina female sexuality, right? And so we're calling this La Virgencita y la Puta, which, oh my gosh, I feel so bad just even saying that word. Anyway, it's like, but this is the Madonna whore complex in Spanish, everybody. So we're gonna dive in. And Jacqui, is it okay if I call you Jacqui for the rest of the time? Because that's
of course.
Okay. Of course. All right. So Jacqui is amazing. She's a colleague in many ways. She's an AASECT-certified sex therapist and also a supervisor. So, and we've been meeting up for years at the AASECT Conference, and we're missing each other because we haven't gotten to see each other for several years. Mm-hmm. With all the AASECT Conference has been online for the last, I think, 3 years now. So anyway, hopefully maybe this year, maybe this summer, I'll get to see you, Jacqui.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. San Francisco will never be the same after there.
That's right. Jacqui's in San Francisco. In San Diego,
I'm
right?
in LA.
You're in LA. Okay, sorry. You're in California. You're working a lot with the Latinx community. But I'd love to give you just a chance to introduce yourself a little bit more, give us a little bit about your background, anything you want to share with us, just kind of how you got into this field, what made you interested in sexuality, anything like that would be awesome to get started with.
Sure. So my name is Jacqui. I am a sex therapist and sex therapy supervisor here in Los Angeles. I do get to supervise people nationally and internationally because sadly, and it's something I'm really trying to change, I'm one of the very few Latinx Spanish speakers who are AASECT certified and who are AASECT certified supervisor. A few years ago, I opened up my center here in Los Angeles, San Fernando Valley, the Center for Relationship and Intimacy WellBeing. And the reason I did that was twofold. One is to give people the opportunity to know you can bring any of the topics here. And secondly, to be able to provide training and supervision to clinicians, particularly BIPOC clinicians. I can go in, that's a whole other conversation, I think. But a lot of Latinx therapists get, in a way, pushed to go into trauma, immigration, and other things. Sexuality and sex therapy is not a lot of them even know about. I joke about my family a lot when it comes to sex, because I feel my family has a lot of dysfunctions. Sex is not one of them. I feel my family, we're really open. We talk about sex. It doesn't matter, male, female, gay, straight, trans. We're very open about sexuality. Again, we have other issues to deal with. But sex happens to be one of the easy ones. And it was quite shocking to me when I left my house and realized, oh, holy crap, this is not the truth for many, right? Particularly people who are Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, whatever name you identify with. It's actually quite the opposite. And I worked with couples a lot. And I find it fascinating that some of my couples had been working with other therapists for 5, 10, 15 years. And the topic of sex had never come up. And that I was the first therapist to actually ask them about their sexual life. And at the time I practiced, I felt was very unique in that I was serving definitely Latinos, Latinx, and I was also serving other people of other cultures and other religions. I worked with a lot of mixed culture marriages or mixed ethnic, mixed religion. And the topic of sex was always the most fascinating with these couples. So that's what led me to AASECT and really become more immersed and more knowledgeable in this field.
I love it. I love that you grew up in a sex positive Latinx family.
I know, we're an anomaly.
That's amazing. So I grew up with an Argentine mom and with a mom who had converted to Mormonism, but also never took the whole Mormonism stuff too seriously. So, and kind of over time, just kind of petered out of the religion, I think. But boy, the sexual messages were there. And I don't think they were coming from Mormonism, right? They were coming, I think, from her Argentine and Catholic background in regards to kind of pretty strict things. I wasn't really allowed to like show any type of PDA in front of my siblings or anything like that. If I had a boyfriend over, I couldn't even really hold hands or kiss anybody, even on the cheek or anything like that, because that would be inappropriate and definitely kind of, showed up with a lot of the anxieties that you see parents like, like close your eyes when there's any kind of sexual scene on the TV or anything like that. And definitely a distrust for erotic women, or anybody who would maybe be a threat to the male gaze, whether that was her spouse or her sons or, whoever she saw as being affected by eroticism in what would be deemed a negative way, a non-righteous way. My mom has come a long way since then, she's also kind of like this feminist and very strong Latina personality. But it's interesting when I look back on my growing up years, how many of those messages were there. I've been wanting to talk to you about this since the Super Bowl, however many years ago, where it was Shakira and J-Lo who were the main kind of performers on the Super Bowl, like the halftime show. And, they brought on, of course, all of their amazing bootylicious, like movements and outfits. And of course, very, Latina presenting, in the sense of their music styles, singing in Spanish, of course, too. And the outroar that kind of happened around, of course, there's a lot of outroars that happen around halftime shows, but they're not unique. It's not just unique to these two women, but there was a lot of outroar about how this was a very sexualized show. There were a lot of young people dancing with them, a lot of younger minor girls, teenage girls, and how they were sexualizing, the younger generation and how inappropriate it was, and the objectification, all these words, that start. I feel like sexualization and objectification are kind of like the two main words we hear that are usually put forth. So it's just the discomfort of anything erotic. But also I do want to kind of, and I hope we tease out today, kind of these two things. Like on the one hand, we do want to be aware of objectification and when that plays a negative role in people's kind of identities. On the other hand, there's this consistent monitoring, especially of female bodies in regards to anything sexual. So that's what I'm hoping we dive into today. Do you want to give me any first response to just that Super Bowl? I know you wrote a piece on it, I think on your blog or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the most fascinating part for me, there's always controversy after a Super Bowl halftime, always. But what made that very unique for me was that people were, yes, they were sexualizing it in ways that was interesting for me. As a Latina, I was so proud of that show. I was so proud that these both women brought themselves. They're bicultural women. They brought in their culture. They brought in what they've learned through the more American part of their lives. And I remember thinking, oh my God, they did a beautiful job of presenting both. And then within an hour of the show, it was like this uproar of these, particularly women, making comments about how dare these women turn on my 16-year-old son, or how dare these women put on this show where my and couldn't stop watching the television. That's a very interesting piece, because from where I was sitting, here are two women that probably grew up in households very much like other Latina women, where sex is, for certain things, we don't talk about it. That's the typical Latina household. And yet they took their sexuality and became empowered through it, which ultimately is what I want for all women. Right? That sexuality is one way to reclaim themselves and reclaim their power, particularly in a world that's very misogynistic and it has severe dualities, right? And even in our languaging, everything's male, everything's female. And, for women to use that part of them in any way they want. They could have worn a burlap for all I care, right? It's how they choose to express themselves that's important. And yet all this other stuff was happening in the background. I found that to be fascinating. So that's when I began speaking about it. But really, we're talking about an issue that is always present in Latin culture. I think it's present in all cultures. I think Latin culture does it so openly, and they just don't care what you think. This is what they're going to do it. And women are always at the losing end of that perspective.
Yeah. No, and I do think that this is a really important thing. As you mentioned, it's usually more the women who are the ones who are monitoring. And I think that, we've obviously been, you can go back into the history, of course, of a lot of things. I usually start off with the history of, for a long time, if you could not, there were just no rights. Women just didn't have any rights. And so if you couldn't attract a male spouse who would protect you and offer you a living, basically, there weren't many options, so I think that the history of females, the value of female attractiveness is mired in so much, just really awful history. And therefore we kind of we've grown up with this inheritance that another person's sexuality, another person's eroticism, another person's aesthetic beauty or sexiness is a direct threat to me and my livelihood and my ability to keep myself alive and surviving. I think that's very intergenerationally woven into the female psyche.
Yeah. And it's still happening in certain countries, right? Right now, in a lot of Central American countries, if a woman has sex outside of marriage and it results in a pregnancy, well, she must now marry this man or figure something out fast. And what's happened, my mother is from El Salvador, so I'm very familiar with the history there, right? In the past, if a man wanted to marry somebody, but she did not like his invitations, didn't express any interest, all he had to do was rape her, get her pregnant, and she automatically became his wife, right? In this particular country, after the war, the Catholic Church came in and said, we need to start bringing in more of the Catholic Church into this country because evangelism had taken over. So the church and state together have formulated these horrendous laws against women's sexuality, where women cannot take birth control, cannot have an abortion unless her husband signs off on it. And if she doesn't have a husband, then she has to have this child. So even today, it's happening, right? There's this reemergence occurring because women, and I also want to bring up a very important topic, because female sexuality not only has to do with the masculine gaze, right? It has to do with colorism, classism, right? If you're educated or not educated, if I am a white woman of an upper class family, I have the ability to be sexual, right? Because who's going to say anything to me? And yet among women, there's slut shaming that occurs if I were to do that. If I were a darker female from a lower class, I better cover up, because the only thing I'm worth is my virginity. So I have to save that, right? So there's also things that occur that are so subtle. And yet again, in the Latin culture, we're very open about it. We talk about it, we mention it, because we go back to machismo, right? And machismo is really what's leading this. So women will, and I always find it so fascinating. When I was a little girl, I would watch television. I would watch Spanish-speaking television with my parents. And the big television shows were people like Iris Chacon. And for those that are not familiar with Iris Chacon, she was this Puerto Rican woman who was, I loved her. I remember being on the coffee table pretending I was her almost every show, because she had such liberty to be herself. She'd wear barely anything and shake her body, but who was around her? Men. Who was the show for? Men. It wasn't for other women. Again, my family was strange. My mother would celebrate her and say how wonderful, how beautiful she was. usually that does not occur in a female household, right? And females would put that show down or would say something negative about how she's doing, but the males were allowed to celebrate it because that was for them to look at. So again, if you look at now, if you look at the current television, right, novelas are a big thing in the Latin culture, but all the women are white women. They're all these beautiful, sexy white women. And you have the poor, dark-skinned maid in the background, and she's fully covered. So these are other nuances to this conversation that are important, right? So I think we could talk about this forever because there's so many things to it. But if we go back to what we're speaking to, the history of this, right? The Catholic Church is a big influence in how this occurred. And now this new texture of I can't even say this word, you know what I'm saying. Evangelicalism. I'm so opposed to it. My body just doesn't want to say the word, right? But all of this has to go back to keeping women's sexuality for the male and for the male gaze and for procreation and for her to continue teaching this to women and teaching this to other men.
Yeah, and I often talk about the dichotomy, right, between kind of the biblical, who are the two probably most main biblical women, is you've got Eve, and you've got Mary. And here's two huge archetypes, of that denote so much around female sexuality, So you've got the mother, the virgin mother that none of us can aspire to.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've figured out how to have virgin births necessarily. I guess IVF maybe, but most people are doing IVF, they're not virgins. So that's an interesting kind of weird thing that we aspire to, this beautiful woman who's holding a baby, and she's always very covered, of course, and very religious and holy and angelic. And then you've got Eve, who kind of was the downfall of mankind, with a lot of religious cultures really tying that to sexuality, as far as the eating of the fruit, the knowledge was all about kind of sex, and she seduced, the poor innocent guy, Adam. And he just,
I find it fascinating because if this is true, then all women come from Eve, right? All women come from Eve. And the way that women are taught to keep the purity of having a child is not to enjoy sex, right? It's quick, it's painful, it's not meant to be enjoyed. It's just part of the wifely duty. So that's one way that they're able to keep the sanctity of themselves as women within the marriage. And, when I say that, I also remind myself that men in many Latin countries to this day are allowed to have extramarital relationships, right? They're allowed to have families, right? There's the idea of la casa grande. That's where life and his children live. Those are his legitimate children. And there's the casitas. The casitas are where his extramarital women and the children born of that extramarital affairs live. Something that is still commonly used. I'm going to bring up my family here because I think this is where the uniqueness of my family lies, is that many of my uncles, we're talking grand uncles here, many of them had their wife and their children, but many of them had girlfriends or just one-time affairs. My great grandmother, God bless her, decided, I'm not going to repeat this story. So she would bring of the other women into her house. I'm sure daughter-in-laws were not thrilled about this, but again, women were disempowered, so they could say very little. But my mother grew up with all of her cousins, whether they were legitimate or not, right? So I think that doesn't happen often. And usually that's shunned upon, right? You keep those children out of here because they represent sin. But many times those other women were the women that actually men were in love with, that they shared their more sexual self with, because the one at home was more of a social political move. It was more families wanting to unite their money together. It was a marriage for different reasons. And we don't talk about that very openly, right? Because if someone is unwilling to reveal her sexuality because she's been told her whole life she's not supposed to, then it's okay for men to go out and find somebody that will. So that also puts women at a different level of competition, right? So her purity is at a higher value because she's legitimate. And the other one is of less value. Well, she put it out there without marriage. Right. So here's another level of competition for women to deal with.
Right. Yeah, so let's dive into this, because I do think it's a dilemma. I think that it's a conundrum. On the one hand, I think if you ask most women, hey, do you think that you should have power in your sexuality or in your sexual choices? I'm guessing most women would say yes. And I think most of us now are also aware that, this kind of idea of male gaze is an issue, that when our sexuality is being either marketed or viewed as valuable only through kind of a male perspective, that's also an issue. So I think a lot of this protection kind of feels that come up for women as they watch, J-Lo, like moving her booty, shaking her booty, is kind of the sense of like, oh, this is meant to arouse, my husband or my children, like you said, my son. And I don't want, like, there's this fight against kind of that idea of male gaze. So how do we advocate for more empowered sexuality without then also going to the other pendulum swing and, managing and micromanaging females' bodies because we're not comfortable with how they're using them?
Yeah, and the biggest mistake that Shakira and J-Lo did is that they didn't have a male companion with them on stage, right? Had a male been present, then that would have neutralized everything. I even have clients today who are being taught, if you're going to dress sexy, well, you're going to do that because you're a friend. But if the boyfriend's gone, then you're not allowed to do that anymore. To answer your question, right? It's twofold job. It's one, teaching young women that they do have the ability to choose for themselves, right? And if they do it, it's because they feel good doing it. They find a way of expressing themselves. And often when I sit with someone, I tell them, it's like, you can wear whatever you want, right? Sexuality is not what you wear. Sexuality is how you feel about yourself. It's how you choose to express yourself, how you express how you want to share of yourself. So if you want to do that wearing sweats, or if you want to do that wearing nothing, wonderful. You did it for yourself, not because you're being taught to hook somebody in, or because you have to show up in a certain way. And when I start talking to young women about that, it's at first, I think they get caught in another conundrum, right? Because they want to do, the rebellious part of them wants to do something different than what they've been taught. But the issue becomes when they get married or they end up connecting with somebody and that person comes from that same mentality. So now they have a choice. Do I choose myself or do I choose the relationship? And that's a really difficult one to handle. So when they come in with couples therapy, right, it's really helping him understand his own masculinity without having to control the feminine, or his own expression of sexuality without having to continue the machismo or the misogynistic thoughts that he was taught. So it's a twofold thing. And with the older generation, I'm finding that, and when I speak of older generation, I'm talking about women 50 times 60 plus, right? I find that these women are slowly waking up, but they're doing it in almost in an enclosed circle. These are not women that go home and share with their spouses, right? I found this out about my sexuality. These are women that it's like a little seed gets planted and they just start nourishing seed until they feel more comfortable with themselves. It is not uncommon that people wait until they are in widowhood to start expressing these things, right? Because the other layer of this is women that are older have children, and these very children will grow up and protect her purity as well, right? So it's one level after the other level, and it's all about empowering women to remind them, you have a choice, you have a choice in this. And the other piece is connecting them with other women who are also ready to look at different choices. When women get stuck many times because they're at home with children, they don't have outside sources, because that's another control, right? That the misogynistic world continues to have on them, is to isolate them once they become mothers. Well, that's all you have to do. So it's to give them an outing, connect them with other women. So as much as these women hated the show or were repulsed by the show, I know deep inside there was something in them, right? Because there's the projection work that's happening with them, but it's also very intriguing for them to see this.
Right, to watch other women in their power. And I still feel like it's a bit of a dilemma, right? Because even when I think about lipstick, the feminist part of me is like, lipstick is stupid, like somewhere along the line, we got the message that in order to be seen as prettier or sexier, our lips are supposed to be a certain shade or plumper or whatever. So the feminist part of me is like, I'll never own lipstick again. The erotic part of me, right? The other part of my brain that is more about like what feels good and doesn't really care about my feminist values is like, I feel sexier. I feel nicer. I feel, I do. Those cultural messages have had an impact. And for me, not everybody enjoys lipstick, but for me, I feel more confident, maybe more in tune with my sexuality, more whatever when I'm wearing lipstick, right? And so I think this is the dilemma, is that at some level, we know that these things are culturally kind of part of our lives, like, booty shorts and cleavage and certain lacy bras and, all the things that are kind of archetypically female, and represent female sexuality. So when I put something like that on, a corset or something that denotes that cultural message, I do feel that way. I know there's lots of non-binary folks and, other types of eroticism that don't necessarily feel that way, but for me, I do. And so I think that's the dilemma, is that, so am I wearing these things for me, or am I wearing these things because of this cultural pressure to conform to misogyny and to the male gaze and to all these things? And I think that's a dilemma that most female bodies are having at some level, and especially when they start raising their own daughters or sons, right? Is what kinds of values do I want to share? And, and then we start getting into the whole modesty rhetoric, right? Which is its own way of micromanaging and having control. And oftentimes modesty rhetoric, even though people feel like it's protective, is all about the male gaze, like don't dress in a certain way that will provoke certain thoughts that then can lead to sex or danger or assault or who knows what, right?
Yeah. Slut shaming is a huge issue in the Latinx community. It's huge, right? You're supposed to be sexy, but don't incite anything. It's like, what kind of messaging is that? Mm-hmm. And if something were to happen, well, that's on you because, well, you wore that. Or if your husband had an affair, well, that's on you because you didn't wear that. It's like, whatever way you choose, you're wrong, right? And that really wears at some women. So that's where they start to control and judge other women in an effort to help themselves feel better. It's funny you say lipstick. I was just talking to somebody about lipstick yesterday. I'm a fan of lipstick. I love lipstick. And because my experience was different. I grew up in Catholic school. I had nuns around me. And I got the messaging that lipstick, especially red lipstick, was evil. So what's the first thing I did when I had the ability to buy lipstick? I put on the reddest lipstick you could find, right? And so for me, that is my way of saying I'm going to wear what I want. And I'm very clear that I don't do it for other people, for myself. And I'm very grateful I have a partner that's do whatever I want with my body. And that's the other issue that Latina women have, is partners that are okay before marriage, wear whatever they want. And then after marriage, they have to literally become a nun overnight. So again, the polarities, this is culturally, religiously, it all just lands on women's sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And their bodies. So what I'm hearing you saying is, regardless of the cultural messages, regardless of those things, let's start with the focus being, how does the female person feel? What do they want for themselves? You know, what's important to them? What's important as part of their expression? What's important? And instead of having those decisions coming from a space of like, oh, how do I keep other people happy? Whether that's my partner or my spouse or culture or, you know, a boyfriend I want to attract or things of that nature. Is that kind of,
yeah. Sometimes when I work with someone that this is new work for them, I ask them to wear something, a piece of jewelry, to wear their hair a certain way. And they don't have to share that with anybody. It's just, they know it and it's for themselves. And that experience by itself is life-changing for some women, right? Like, I get to wear this earring because I feel good wearing that earring, and I'm not doing it because my husband's asking me to do it or because the women at church are asking me to do it. I'm doing it because it feels good. So they start having a relationship with themselves first, right? Because for a lot of Latinas, their sexuality first belongs to mom and dad, who get to safekeep it. Then their sexuality belongs to their first boyfriend or lover, right? And then finally, it belongs to their children, because once they have children, their sexuality has to be zipped up and put away for the sake of the children. So to help them create a space, even if it's as small as a ring or a toenail or an earring, that's all to themselves, that they don't get to share anything with anybody, right? Selfishness in the Latin culture is very looked down upon. And sexual selfishness, that's incredibly taboo. So for women to start knowing that they can do these little things, right? They don't have to come out looking like J-Lo or Shakira. They can do something that's just for them, and it's their own unique way of being in the world. And again, it doesn't belong to mom and dad, doesn't belong to husband, doesn't belong to kids. And that's usually a really sweet start for them, right? And sometimes it develops different things, but it doesn't have to.
And as people, you know, get more comfortable with themselves, like I've worked with people who do start dressing differently or start, you know, presenting differently, more confident. But especially if people start presenting in a more like what's considered typically sexual way, you know, maybe they are showing more cleavage, or they're showing lace, or they're showing their bra strap, or you know, things like that. And then they get this pushback, you know, from people in their community or their lovers or whomever. And people will say like, oh, you're only doing this for attention, or you're only doing this to attract, you know, something that's, you know, outside of like what would be considered a moral relationship. What are some things that people can say back to that? Like what are ways that people can stand up and advocate for themselves?
That's such a difficult conversation for so many of the women to have, right? Because for the first time, their skill or a muscle that they very much, I always remind them that they can choose to share things, or they can choose not to share. It is not their job to pacify somebody else, right? I love that oftentimes husbands or partners blame me, the therapist, when I'm working with them. It's like, it's that therapist putting things in your head, right? And I often invite them into the session. It's like, well, I'm here, you know, tell me all the wrongdoings that I'm doing. And often I find these men I've had men literally just fall to tears in front of me, because they're also holding on to all of this and never got to fully express their sexuality. But to women who are out there at the beginning and they're getting this pushback from people, I often tell them, just agree with the problem. You're right, I am. Yes, I am. It's like, there's no explanation you're going to give that's going to win you here, right? There's nothing that's going to happen here that's going to be good for you. So just agree with the conversation, and then you get to complete the conversation. There's no arguing here.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's also such a thing that we feel, I think, coming from these cultures, is that we have to justify or explain ourselves, right? And just starting to understand that that's not owed to anyone. You don't owe an explanation. to anyone. I mean, if you want to give it, that's fine. But all right. So when we're looking at, so I mean, we talked a lot about male gaze. We've talked a lot about kind of just presentation of dress or attire. But there are other things too, right? That kind of fall into this kind of Virgen, Puta dichotomy. So we could probably talk something about like gender roles. We've talked a lot about the mother role, but do you want to talk a little bit more about just kind of what are some of the gender roles that Latina women in particular are kind of, facing on a regular basis?
Yeah, so because most of the gender roles have to do with the suegra or the mother-in-law. How you treat your son is such a big deal to the mother-in-law. But the current issues, there's birth control. Who's in charge of control? That's a big one, right? Who's in charge of childcare? Who's in charge of just the house? It is not uncommon I've heard this from men where they say, well, those are her kids, as if they had nothing to do with the child. I've seen other people say, well, that's men's work. This is women's work. And it doesn't matter if the woman had a 9 to 5, right? It still falls under her criteria of womanly work. But birth control I'm going to go back to birth control for a moment, because that's a huge issue. There's a lot of Latino males that refuse to wear condoms and refuse to be participants of any kind of birth control. In the Catholic Church, they have to be interviewed. And in that interview, you have to promise to have all the children God. Right? And the underlying piece of that, who's the one that gets stuck with the kids at home? It's the women. It's another way of controlling women and their choices. But a lot of women have had to getting birth control undercover. They don't share with their husbands that they are on birth control, but many of them don't realize they have that on. And again, in other Latin countries, if somebody wants to be on the pill, she has to get permission from her husband. So there's another issue there for a lot of women. How do I become a sexual being and be sexual in my life if that's going to lead to pregnancy?
Yeah, exactly. And if there's hesitation for condoms, I'm guessing there's also a huge hesitation for vasectomies or, anything of that nature. So that does put the onus of the responsibility on the female. And like you're saying, the consequences fall on the female as well. So I know here in the United States, we have huge issues still with egalitarianism, in heterosexual couples, where I think the current research shows that if you are the stay-at-home dad and you have a working mom, then the domestic responsibilities seem to be shared equally. And that's about the only, and that's equally. So she's still doing as much as he's doing, in the home, even though she's working, full time, and he's the homemaker, right? The home take care or whatever. Yep. So those gender roles are old and, heavy. And that's here in the United States. I mean, I'm sure that the population they interviewed was diverse, but when you think about Latino cultures, I think that's even more of kind of that macho view of, I'm not going to change diapers. I'm not going to do women's work. I'm not going to clean the kitchen. I'm definitely not going to clean the toilets. Those are not necessarily things that a lot of stereotypical Latino men will see as viable. Mm-hmm.
And even if a male wants to do those things within their own culture and community, they get put down, right? They are called mandilones. They're called different terrible names, right? To the point where they get said, if you're doing women's work, how are you going to satisfy your wife? So their sexuality gets attacked. And it's hard. It's a very hard thing to manage. With a lot of couples that I work with, and we talk about biculturalism and bilingualism, right? It's like when we speak Spanish, we may speak in a certain way. When we speak English, we speak in a certain way. And it's almost like to protect what they're wanting to create for their families, they have to speak a different language around their families, right? They may have to not share things with their families that they're trying to create as a couple and with their children, especially couples that have a trans child or a child that's gay, right? They get this feedback from the family of how things should be, it's because, you're helping your wife with housework. That's why your child is having issues with sexuality or their gender. People start isolating and having more distance from family members, which is sad because in the Latin culture, family and intergenerational family connection is so important, right? But many families and young couples have had to make the decision of, well, here's what we were sharing and here's what we're not sharing. And that's okay too.
Right. Yeah. And since we're on the topic of gender roles, which I think does play hugely into gender identity and also sexual orientation, because those gender roles are so heteronormative, they're so much like, you're a man and this is what that's going to mean and look like. You're a woman, that's what that's going to mean and look like. It's very much based on what genitalia you're born with. And so what are the current kind of statistics or knowledge around, both gender binary and trans people in the Latin community? How are they being accepted? What if any progress is being made in those departments, as well as sexual orientation? And I mean, like, I know in Argentina, like, gay marriage was, I think, passed even before here in the United States. So I was kind of like, oh, wow, that's huge, but I know too that every country, in South America differs fairly significantly as well. We can't just say, it's hard when we're talking about a Latin culture because there's so many different countries and so many cultures within the Latin culture. But what's your general sense?
Yeah. And you're bringing a good point, right? Because often in this country, when we talk about Latin culture, we think of it as a big, gigantic monolith, but there are literally 36 different countries. And each country has their own gender, culture, sexuality. Everything's very different. So to respond to you, there's still there's gay marriage is not even a topic in most countries. It's starting to, I feel like places like Argentina, Mexico, those are places that are starting to have more open conversations. But the Central American countries, they're usually the last ones to catch into these things, right? And you also have to think of it from a political point of view. These countries have been at war and had a lot of inner turmoil in the last 40, 50 years. So they're having to deal with all of that before they come to this conversation. What I am seeing is a lot of us, right? A lot of television shows are openly trans folks. They're only showing gay couples. They're talking about gender fluidity in spaces that normally you would never hear those things. So they're doing it. So the Latin countries, in a way, they're slowly normalizing it, right? But the laws and the politics haven't quite caught up. My mother is a big novela person, and anybody who has a Latina mom knows they're watching novelas from like 7 to 11. That's the novela time. And a few times when she's been, or I've been with her, I've been just so surprised in the best way possible, right? That they're showing, one novela had a man talk about his going from she born a male and was talking about the whole, her journey, right, into being a woman. And they did it so subtly where you could tell they were just putting it out there, but they didn't want to stir the pot too much, right? They don't want the show to shut down. A lot of television hosts, and in Latin countries, television hosts are big celebrities. Now they're openly gay and they talk about their partners and their children. Like, you see 2 gay men adopting a child. No one talks about it. And that's what Latin culture is really good at. We see it, we may not talk about it, but at least we're seeing it and we're looking at it through a different lens. There's still more pushback for lesbian couples. That is something that is not as open in the culture, because again, how dare 2 women be sexual with 2 women, right? 2 gay men has a connotation than 2 lesbian women in a relationship together. That's still something that I don't see as open. There's hints of it, but is accepted as gay or even trans folks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we kind of went through that here in the States too, right? I mean, like Will and Grace, that was like, what, 15, 20 years ago, or Modern Family. And so it's a lot of times the media does play a huge role in starting to normalize some of these minority populations. But yeah, it's interesting too, as we're moving into kind of ethical non-monogamy becoming more of a topic that's being considered and talked about, especially in the context of what you're talking about with kind of the main wife, but then the mistress, the archetype mistress, and whether or not there will be some shifts into the possibility of ethical non-monogamy instead of these kind of just I'll do whatever I want from the male perspective anyway, right?
Yeah. I often joke in a way that ethical non-monogamy, well, it is consensual in a way because the wife is aware that this is happening, right? And sometimes it's like, rather than having to deal with that, just go over there. So in an odd way, they've been practicing some type of consensual non-monogamy. They just don't call it that, right? The difference is that the male is the only one that is able to choose to do this. The female choosing to do this is not something that is talked about. And actually, that would be shunned greatly in the culture, right? And I'm going to bring up the Shakira news, right? Because she's going this breakup with her partner of so many years. She recently put a song out that it talks all about the relationship, and so many women in particular are like, oh yes, finally women, we're not gonna, this is such a great song, nobody has heard it. And yet all these men are coming out saying, how dare she talk about this? She didn't think of her children, yet her partner who had affairs, he's never said, no one ever says about him, well, he didn't think about the children before the affairs or before, he left the relationship to go with someone else. So again, here's another example of a woman saying, that's what occurred and here's me, but how dare she not think of the kids first?
Right. What's the name of the song? Do you remember by chance?
Oh my goodness. I will Shakira and put Piqué's song. Piqué is her former partner. You'll see it.
Okay.
There's some places where you can get it translated too.
Okay, I'll look it up and post a link to it.
It's a great song. That and Miley Cyrus together are the combo out of Latin speaking social media. It's wonderful.
Okay. All right. That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is, before we run out of time, so there was a study not too long ago that was done on Ecuadorian women, and they talked about kind of overall views about sexual kind of messaging or assertiveness. Those messages could be grouped into 5 categories. I think we've talked a lot about these. One was huge, gender roles schemata, right? So yeah, that's a huge thing. Concerns about the partner's thoughts and reactions. So again, I think as usual, I see this a lot in high demand religious cultures here in the United States, that it's the woman's job to take care of the male ego, right? Especially sexually.
Yes.
I think men get a lot of messages too about caring for the female, but kind of in different ways, like maybe providing for her or protecting her from danger or even not hurting her feelings. But for a woman, it's a lot about protecting the male sexual ego and helping him feel comfortable in that space. So I think we've kind of talked about that as well. We talked about contraception, so gendered attitudes towards the use of specific methods of contraception, replication of family patterns, which you talked about. But the one that we haven't really addressed, talking about sexual histories as a challenging task. So I would assume this means, whether they've had premarital sex or had even a sexual assault or anything along those lines, that now puts you in kind of like damaged goods category. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as I said, if at the sort of towards the middle of this conference, right, it is not uncommon. And I'm going to say it hasn't been that long since one of the ways that men would get wives was by raping them, impregnating them, and then she's stuck at that point because she doesn't have freedom to choose. So that has happened and continues to occur. It might not be in the same male that's doing it because there's different things that are occurring politically in Latin countries, but that still happens, right? When we talk about sexual history, males are allowed to have as many conquests as they would like to have. In fact, most males, and again, this is going to sound like this happened 50 years ago. No, this is happening right now. Males in Latin culture are pushed to go out and conquer women. And I want to use the word conquer, right? Because it's not about being in relationship with them. They want to conquer them. So they go out there and have as many women. We're talking age 15, 16, right? And in some areas, it's not uncommon where the father and the uncles take this young boy to have his first sexual experience at a brothel. right? So that way he knows what to do. Where the contrary happens with women, right? Women are sheltered from this. They're not supposed to know what's happening. They're not even allowed to see animals procreating. That they're very sheltered. And I hear from a lot of women where they say the first sexual encounter, they had no idea what was happening, no clue what was going on. They just remember it was painful and they just wanted it to be done. So here's how virginity in many ways is treated, right? And as males grow older, there is this idea of, because they've had all these conquests, they should know how to then pleasure a woman, right? They should know how to pleasure a woman. But again, the priority is, does she know how to pleasure him? When here there's a contradiction, right? Because if she's been sheltered, has never had any conversations about anything sexually, how is she supposed to know to do that?
Right. Well, and even him, if he's conquesting, how much has he really learned about being a good lover?
Yeah, those are my favorite clients. I find that I have a variety of clients, and I'm talking about the Latino client, right? There's the young couple that came from ultra religious background. They're like, we have no clue what we're doing. I don't know how to do this. I'm scared to do this. I have no idea. Then my other favorite couple are those that are in their 40s and 50s. Kids are out of the house and she's like, I'm done. Like, putting your penis in my face is not how I want to start having sex. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about how we're going to do this. Mm-hmm. Right. And then there's my third one, which is a woman that's like, I'm out. I need to go through my sexuality and learn who I am, because my next partner is going to treat me better. Mm-hmm. Those are the three people I often see in my practice, right? And the idea that how we raise men to think of themselves as sexual beings is obviously there's huge consequences, right? You have men who are oftentimes not hetero, pushed into hetero relationships, yes. Right? There's a lot of ace men, bisexual men, trans folks that are like, I just did this because I was supposed to. And the shame that comes because they weren't able to speak. Well, how are you supposed to speak out at the age of 15 or 16? It's impossible. So we get a lot of men also who have dealt with this issue using alcohol. It is not uncommon, right? Alcoholism is a huge issue in the Latin community. And on the other side, we have women, right? We go back to the purity. How have they been able to protect themselves from having painful sex, from having sex that they don't like? Well, that's by becoming completely pure virgins again. Had my children, I'm done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right. Oh, goodness. I could talk for another hour.
Easy. We could talk about this forever.
Yes. I mean, I've had many gay men in particular who come from Latin cultures, who maybe are now converted to Mormonism or whatever, tell me exactly that story. I was taken when I was 15 or 16 to a brothel. I wasn't able to perform. I didn't know how to perform. I wasn't attracted. There are these gay kids, and then the shame of that. One client in particular, the sex worker shamed him in front of his father, like basically saying, yeah, this didn't, he doesn't know what he's doing. It didn't work. He couldn't even get it up with me or something along those lines. And so just the shame of that, in regards to being pushed into a certain sexual identity that doesn't, I would even think for a heterosexual kid, that would be very pressure oriented, not to mention sexual abuse, really, when you think about these minors who are being, forced to have adult sexuality, so, but it's a very different cultural context, from maybe some of the ideas we would have here in the States. And then even when you were talking about the non-monogamy piece, with women who kind of understand, they know that this is happening behind their backs, that there's no power there. It's going to happen anyway, right? So that in a sense, that's a coping mechanism. It's like, I'll just ignore this because what am I going to do about it? There's nothing really I can do to stop this from happening. So I think for a lot of women, it's just trying to survive that with as much dignity as they can, where there's different styles, I guess, of doing that. All right. Well, final thoughts, Jacqui. What, if you had to like sum it up and say, okay, here's the beauties of Latin culture. Here's some of the struggles we have as, in general, where do we want to go? What's the hope? What's the evolution? What's the education? What kind of message do we want to share?
I mean, I am so proud to be a Latina. I love my culture. I love that I get to pick even from the Catholic Church, I get to pick certain things that I love. And then I get to pick certain things that I love from my American side, and I get to be myself in the middle of it. And I want to have that be a place of hope for women and for men, right? When you're in this country, and even if you're in another country listening to this, you can choose what you love from your family. You can choose what you love from other spaces, and then step into that, right? It's not black and white anymore. And I think the other piece that's happening, which is I welcome evolution for women and men, is that there's choices now, right? There's people who are choosing not to have children. There are people who are choosing to have sex for pleasure. I know the older generation doesn't understand it. But some of them are coming around, and I'm going to bring up my grand aunt. I chose not to have children. And for the longest time, she's like, I don't understand. Now that she's in her 80s, like, I totally get why. It's like, sometimes you just want time for yourself. Sometimes there's other things you want to focus on. It's like women have choices now. So if my almost 90-year-old grand aunt can come to that conclusion, it's like, don't give up on family members. It might take some time, right? But they will come around in their own way, not in the way that you want them to come around, to give yourself permission to do it. It's like, give yourself permission to be who you are, and then let them catch up with you, right? And it's just as much as you don't want to be judged by other people. Don't judge those. They're also stuck in old ways of being. They're doing their best.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say amen to a lot of that, or a woman. Yeah, right. I too love my Latina heritage. I love all the complexities of kind of different cultural, framings. And there's a lot of similarities, I think, in regards to kind of religious upbringings. But there are some distinct differences. And I think that whether you're listening to this as a white person and just kind of learning empathy and understanding, or whether you're listening to this as a Latin person, brown person, hopefully there's this kind of common ground of, like, I loved what you said about permission, giving yourself permission to begin the exploration of who you are sexually, to begin the exploration of what types of traditions do we come from that we want to abandon. Do I want to continue to share with my children this fear of erotic bodies, or do I want to teach them the celebration of movement and of choice, and that people can present in booty shorts or burlap sacks and still be wonderful, beautiful sexual beings in whatever ways they identify? And how do we start creating that culture within our families, which is, I think, the foremost place where we have influence, and then of course other types of advocacy as well if we're open to it. So Jacqui, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. I just want to say this for the clinicians watching this, is to ask your client, where they're from, their immigration story, how their family got here, what is the social political status that they had in their country, because all of that is going to actually inform who they are sexually, how they express their gender. Because somebody who came from the capital city is going to have a whole different experience than somebody who came from a farm area, right?
Yes.
And I think a lot of times as clinicians, we're taught to look at the Latinx community as one gigantic community. We're not. We're different, depending where we came from, what country. It's like, be curious, ask them. And most don't take it to heart. We don't get judgy if, where's your family from, and how did your family come here? I think these are important conversations we also need to normalize, as clinicians. So I'll stop now because I keep going on that topic.
No, I think that's really important. There's a lot of immigratory shame. There's a lot of, even the current culture here, as far as whether or not you're here in a legal way or illegal way, and all the horrible language we have around some of those issues. So I think sometimes I think as clinicians, sometimes we shy away from what we feel are really sensitive topics, but those are the topics that people need to feel like we are resilient enough and culturally, humble enough to be able to sit with the complexities of all of that, including which generation came to the States first.
Yeah, so. That's such an important conversation that we forget to have as clinicians with our, not just Latinx culture, right? All cultures that come from other. It's important to know. It'll inform you in ways that you never thought.
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you, Jacqui. I hope to see you this summer in San Francisco for AASECT.
Fingers crossed.
And I wish you nothing but the best. So thank you so much for your time with us today.
Of course.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Piccini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the novel, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland